Okay, so let's look at Prep Test 39 Game 1, which is from December 2002. So the first game from December 2002. This is a complex linear game, and the reason it's complex instead of just a regular linear game, or the reason that it might be helpful to think about it as complex, is because it has this extra um, characteristic of each of the variables. So we have these files, right, and they just call them HMO, PV, X, T, and Z. But in addition to just having these file names, and we could have rules just about the file name directly, we also know that each of these files belongs to one of three subcategories, red, green, or yellow. And so that makes it possible for us to, for the LSAT to actually give us rules about the category instead of just about the file itself. And so we have to deal with that extra characteristic, and that's why you might call it an advanced or complex linear game. Um, Okay, so the red files are going to be HM and O, the green files are PV and X, and the yellow files are T and Z. So let's quickly go through the rules. What it says is that the first rule says H must be placed into some position before O, but H cannot immediately precede O. So here's where it says H has to be before O, and then this part is saying that H and O uh, can't be next to each other. So basically, H is going to have to precede O by at least one space. Actually, let me be careful. There's going to have to be H is going to have to precede O, and there's going to have to be at least one space in between them. Okay. Uh, the next rule says that X comes before V. So that's simple enough. And we just write that down. But then when we get to the next rule, we realize that they really want us to apply the same information that they gave us about H and O to X and V. And in fact, they want us to make sure that X and V are not just not immediately next to each other the same way that H and O are not immediately next to each other, but they want us to make sure that X and V have exactly the same number of spaces between them that H and O have between them. So whatever number of spaces we leave between H and O, that's how many spaces we need to leave between X and V. And that means just like with H and O, where there's going to be at least one space in between them, there's going to be one space between X and V. All right? The next rule says, down here, says that Z immediately precedes M. So that's straightforward enough. That's a regular block, and we're used to dealing with that. And then finally, the last rule is where they go to give us a rule about the category of the file instead of the file directly, where they say that the first file cannot be read. And what does that mean concretely for us? It means the first file cannot be H, M, or O. Okay, so let's figure out how these rules are gonna come together to make deductions, or what not laws we can, what no-goes we can generate. Let's see. So we can start at the top. It says H before O, so we know that H can't be. Sorry, one second. And this should. There's no reason for that to be red. Okay, so H can't be last because it has to come before O, and O can't be first because it has to come before H. All right, the same thing with X and V. X can't be last and V can't be first. And then when we look at the third rule, that kind of doesn't generate any not laws. When we look at this rule, we get Z before M. So that means that Z can't be last and M can't be first. And then the final rule says that, H, M, and O cannot be first. So we already had a couple of these. We already had the O and the M up here, but now we need to make sure we have the H here too as a no-go under 1, because no red files are allowed to be first. In terms of your setup, that's all I really think you can do, because none of the other rules allow for you to put anything in none of the rules allow you to put anything in concretely, and so it's hard for you to make deductions here. Um, so what I would do is just go into the questions. So let's do that quickly. The first question is just a list question, and you would just go through there, take each rule, get rid of the answer choices that violate that rule, and then go to the next rule and do the same thing. So let's do that quickly. So H has to be before O, and they can't be right next to each other. That's how I'm summarizing the first rule. So A is okay, B is okay. C is a problem because H and O are right next to each other. So we would get rid of C, and then we look at D, and D is okay, and E is okay. So we go to the next rule, that X has to be before V. And again, let's just make sure that they're not right next to each other. And indeed, whatever number of spaces that was between H and O, let's make sure that X and V have that number of spaces between them as well. So we'll just go ahead and apply both of these rules, the second and the third rules, these two rules, this one and this one and this one, at the same time. Okay, so let's see. In A, x is before v, and it's separated. It has one in between the x and the v, the same way that the h and o have one in between them. So A checks out for those rules. On B, the same thing. X and V are there's one in between X and V, and there's one in between H and O. C we already got rid of. In D, there's the X is before the V, and there's two spaces in between. The same thing with the H and the O, so D is okay. And then we look at E, and we see that the X and the V, X is before V, but X is immediately before V, and we know that that's going to be a violation. Because they need to be separated by, there needs to be at least one space in between them, the same way that there's at least one space in between the H and the O. So far we got rid of C, we got rid of E, and did we get rid of any others? I think we did, right? No, I think that's it. So we got rid of C and E. And now we have to go to the next rule, which says Z has to come immediately before M. So it does in A, but it does not in B. So B would be out. So we got rid of B, C, and E. And then the last rule says the first file cannot be read, but in A, they put the first file as H, which is a read file. So we would get rid of A, and the answer here would be D. All right? So hopefully that's not difficult. Let's go to number 2. The largest possible number of files that can separate Z from H is. All right, so we want Z and H to be as far apart as possible. So normally when you want things to be as far apart as possible, you just put one of them in one and the other one in the last spot, and you try to see if that will work, and then you move in from there. If you know you can't keep them all the way apart on opposite ends of the diagram, then you just move it. You move one of the variables in one space, and you check whether that's going to work. Um, in this case, we would try the same approach, except right away, a couple of things should become apparent to us that will lead us to acknowledge right away, instead of trying to put them as far apart as we can and then moving them in. We can just right away say, well, we know we're not going to be able to put Z and H on completely opposite ends of the board, because the H is going to have to come before the O, and the H is there's actually going to have to be a space in between the H and the O. All right. So if we try to put Z first, then like let's say we try to put Z here. Okay, we're trying to keep them as far apart as possible. So one way to do it would be to put Z at the beginning and then to put H towards the end. But now we need to remember that H can't be last because O has to come before it. And in fact, we should have had a not law here right from the beginning, because H can't be 7 either, because if we put H here, then O would have to be an 8, but H and O are not allowed to be next to each other. And the same thing applies, actually, now that we think about it, for X as well, because X and V, X can't be 8th because it has to come before V, but it also can't be 7th because it needs to be separated by at least one space from V. Okay, so if we put Z in 1 and we want to keep H as far apart as possible, the best we're going to be able to do is to put H in 6. So the most that we'll be able to put in between Z and H is 4 spaces, right? These 4 spaces right here. So if we put the Z first, the most we're going to be able to generate in between Z and H is 4. So what happens if we put the H first? Well, you'll notice right away the H can't go first, right? Because it's a red file and no red files are going to go first. So if we want to put the H towards the beginning and try to put the Z towards the end, we would have to put the H in 2. And then we notice that the Z cannot be an 8 because it has to be immediately before M. So the latest that the Z could be is 7. So then we count the number of spaces in between, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's the same deal. There's 4 spaces in between, just like when we tried to put the Z towards the beginning and the H towards the end. So no matter how we try it here, there's going to be a maximum of 4 spaces in between Z and H. So we would look for that as the answer, and indeed that would be C.